So up next is Critical Mass Strategy Director Mark Mulvey to discuss the psychology of play and how world-building techniques in the gaming industry can be applied in the advertising industry.
Thank you. Everyone can hear me? Yeah? Good morning. Hi. I love this. This is a room full of strategy. This is so cool. I was telling a friend that I was attending StratFest, and they were like, "Is that like a Stratocaster guitar festival?" And I was like, "No, it's even better." And I lost it. My name is Mark Mulvey. I work at a company called Critical Mass. We are an digital experience design agency. We work with brands to build all sorts of digital immersive experiences. We constantly put the user, the consumer, the player at the center of everything. We have a relentless focus on making sure that we're an advocate for the user side of the equation on behalf of our brands that we work with. We're actually a global agency. We're based in Calgary, hence the Canadian flag little mushroom spread I have on here, but most of our executive team sits in New York. But as you can see, I'm not a game designer. I'm not a game designer, so I don't work in the industry of video games. So you're probably wondering, hopefully, like, why video games? Why are we talking about video games at StratFest? And I think if you walk away now and you only have kind of one takeaway and you tune out and you're kind of checking emails, I would just suggest that there's a lot to learn from the world of video games. One, and that you might not be considering it in the right way. Maybe gamification isn't really all there is to it. But the other reason I wanted to talk about video games is kind of anecdotally and through experience. I've found that even though we all maybe play the occasional Candy Crush or played Super Mario Brothers growing up, a lot of people don't play video games, I think especially within the strategy discipline. And so hopefully I can share some ideas and thoughts with you that you wouldn't have encountered otherwise. And I've found it to be a super rich area to mine insight, human behavior, and just a lot of digital experiences. It's a world that literally, it's an industry of designing digital immersive experiences. That's what games are. So the idea to dismiss it as kind of an after-work activity seems a little misguided. So that's why I'm here, and hopefully you get something out of it. So why video games? We kind of addressed that. You should probably wonder, like, why me? Like, why? Okay, fine, I get the video game topic, but why you? I've spent a long time, actually a lot of time in my career, thinking about video games, especially linking them to the advertising and marketing world. I actually got into the strategy discipline 10 years ago now, through a presentation. I was working as a project manager at the time at an agency, and I gave a presentation called Reality is Broken. It was on a book about why games make us better and how they can change the world, which caught the attention of the head of strategy at the time. And so that's kind of how I made my entry into the strategy discipline. This was an article I wrote on Medium, about in 2016, talking about a game called No Man's Sky. And kind of using a Mad Men analogy along the way, because my brain is constantly trying to kind of make things relevant. Maybe one day I could expense a video game as part of my job. That was kind of the motivational aspect. So I've been thinking a lot of the kind of cross-pollination. Then a year later, actually in 2017, still thinking. This was actually when the Nintendo Switch had just come out. And the article I called it Best Available Interface, which was a play on this notion of best available screen, which was kind of being talked about a lot in 2013 or so, 2012, in regard to people being in the living room. You'd think they'd be using, watching and consuming content on their TV screen, but they're actually on their couch on their phone, and why that is, and that people use the best available screen. Nintendo, a lot of hardware design insight came from the fact that there's also a best available interface. And we can think about things in terms of that paradigm. So, so I've been thinking a lot about kind of connecting these worlds. I think that it would, behoove all of us to maybe let that wall dividing them dissolve. But more importantly, earlier this year, I went to my first PAX East festival. I don't know how many of you are familiar with PAX East. I wasn't. I had a friend who was presenting at PAX East for one of their panels, because he actually works in the games industry. It's a gaming convention. It's going on for about 10 years now. It's amazing. To think about PAX East, think of, imagine StratFest, only it's like nothing like StratFest. So everything that StratFest is, just pretend it's the opposite of that. AAA publishers, Facebook was there, of course, with Oculus. Indie developers, there's a tabletop game area, as far as the eye can see, tabletop games everywhere, card games, retro gaming corners. There's even a handheld nook where people are in beanbag chairs kind of playing handheld games. super positive, super inclusive. You know, costumes all over the place, but it's also the first convention I went to where you can put a sticker on your badge declaring your preferred pronoun. So, you know, super, I think, inviting community of people, but there were also a series of panels and discussion with game developers, game designers, game players. These are a few of my Instagram stories along the way. There was a panel called "So You Want to Use Games in Your Job?" parentheses somehow, and a lot of people with PhDs and doctorates and clinical psychologists were talking all about how they use games at the center of their practice, how their dissertation was based on video games, and a lot of people in the audience are just desperate to kind of use their love of games in the real world. So I thought, like, ooh, recruiting opportunity, wait a second, this is kind of like work related. This was the only merch I bought, The Psychology of Zelda, linking our world to the Legend of Zelda series. And then here, I mean, it was just kind of like laid bare, you know, influencers and brands, putting it all together. That was largely in regards to Twitch influencers, but it started, you know, getting the gears rolling about what we could learn from this world. And I mean, ultimately, I think this is like one of my, you know, part of my life operating system, kind of life philosophies, which is seeing things like this as material. So seeing encounters as material and constantly, you know, walking around saying, how can I use this? Everything is potentially useful. I think especially for strategists to think along those lines is very helpful. You know, the first of, I think, you know, a few video game analogies I'm going to make right now is in regards to Minecraft. It's exactly how Minecraft works. You might find this redstone block along the way, or in the game. It's perfectly useless for a very long time. When you mine it, it becomes dust, but eventually you learn the recipe to turn it into what is basically a proto-wire. It's like a circuit, and once you think circuit, you're thinking ones and zeros. You can actually make a light switch for your house. But again, when you're in the world of ones and zeros, you can actually build way more sophisticated things like this tremendously useful machine. So if you didn't hang on to the redstone block because you said, well, this is useless, I don't need this right now, you could never make a machine that can help you out in this way. And so what I'm really describing here is this kind of algorithm, basically, the explore, exploit algorithm. And the idea being, you know, there's a period of time in which you explore, maybe mine for things, you know, discover, gather, and then there's a period of time in which you kind of use that to make a decision. A lot of times in our industry, people kind of swap them. You're asked to exploit something, you're asked to do something, and then you go out and explore. But the exploring should happen at all times, because you never know when you're going to need it or when you're going to be called upon. The proportion here between explore, exploit is deliberate, and it came from a book called Algorithms to Live By, The Computer Science of Human Decisions. And this quote, deciding when to stop your quest for the ideal apartment or ideal spouse depends entirely on how long you expect to be looking. And so you basically essentially time box your search period, and then based on you know, statistics, you're statistically most probable to make the best decision 37% of the way through your search period. So if you're spending a month looking for an apartment, you should calibrate for 11 days and then get the you know, next best of all you can find. I put this in here because it's kind of like a bonus helpful hint for anyone looking for a spouse or an apartment. That's kind of where this whole kind of algorithm and way of thinking about the world came from. So I just wanted to kind of share that, and you know, I think it's easy to drift into kind of fun video game territory and avoid relevance to kind of everyday needs. We are the digital agency of record for BMW North America, and BMW is the client I've been working with since I've been at Critical Mass. And we were working on a big project, not, you know, we were in the midst of it when I went to PAX, and this might happen to you. I wanted to share it because we were working on a super complicated project, heavy back-end lift, front-end development, a lot of user testing along the way, and then we got this kind of an incessant feature request from the client that kept coming up in meetings, and it was more fun. Kept asking for more fun. I want more fun. There's a little alignment problem here, but I'm just going to go with it. More fun, and so you know, this is an example of a client request where, you know, I think immersing yourself in the world of games and being familiar and having an intuition about what makes something fun turns out to be tremendously helpful. Luckily, I immediately went to the world of games and thought, well, what if we had a game designer on staff? How would they respond to that? What would they search for? What kind of vocabulary would they use to articulate what makes something fun? I think for anyone in the room on the client side, on the brand side, if you ask this of your agency, what would success look like to you? How would you know that you hit on fun? Would you be able to articulate what was missing from the experience that was disappointing you? And so I realized there was kind of a gap on both sides of the equation about not having the words or the thinking kind of in your toolbox to kind of be able to address this in a very clear manner. So I think, you'd be surprised how often, requests like this come up and how useful games can be. So I wanted to take a step back real quick and talk about what games even are before I start diving in to some things you can do. Now, there's 4 typical traits to a game. Again, any kind of game, not just video games. There's a goal. This gives a player a sense of purpose. There are rules. This encourages strategic thinking, creativity, right? There's constraints, there's boundaries. There's a feedback system. This is like points, streaks, things like that. Are you doing a good job? Are you doing a bad job? Did you die? Are you succeeding? And it acts as kind of motivation. And then the 4th, participation is voluntary, arguably the most important one. Opting in ensures a safe, pleasurable space, perfectly optional, perfectly unnecessary. And this is all fine and good, and I think most people use some variation of this definition to talk about what games are, but then I submit to you gardening games. If you've ever played a gardening game, it's you cultivate a garden, most of the times literally, and you're kind of part of a community. And a key principle of gardening game design, like this one, Stardew Valley, which is hugely popular game, is that relationships take time. You're doing things on a daily basis. You're thinking about harvest, you're thinking about crops, you're thinking about making sure that you don't over-cultivate the land, because then you wouldn't have a harvest to share with townsfolk. And you want to wish townsfolk happy birthdays when it's their birthday, so that they maybe are more likely to help you out. There's no objective, there's no end state, it's an infinite play. Some of these other traits of a gardening game is sustainability. Again, infinite play, the aesthetic of caretaking. You can choose where you put your garden. You can choose to make it ugly, but no one does. They kind of impose this rule that you want to have a nice little farm. Coziness, the aesthetic of coziness. So are these goals? Like, is this a game? Because there's really no objective, and actually 3 of the 4 rules, apart from being voluntary, are kind of broken. Why do people even play these games? You're not winning, you're not competing. There's actually no real rules apart from just the interface. And so what we're really talking about with games, I think, is the true defining trait of a game is something called the illusory attitude, and it's a definition from Bernard Suits. He said, no, this is easy. A game is playing a game is the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. This is my favorite definition of a game by far. Every part of this sentence is really important. The voluntary attempt, again, it has to be opt-in, it has to be optional. To overcome unnecessary obstacles. The obstacles can't be necessary, but really what this is a description of is friction. And we're, as an experience design agency, constantly trying to make things frictionless, make it easy for users to do things. They go home and they try to do things that are very difficult, and they voluntarily make things more difficult for themselves as a way of decompressing. Like, there's a paradox at work here. So being able to kind of understand what it is that motivates gamers, because we're spending my entire 8-hour workday trying to eliminate what they're actually racing home to do. So I knew something was kind of amiss here. But the illusory attitude is essentially when you decide I'm playing a game. It's the mindset when you sit down to a game of Monopoly or you press the start button on your video game that I'm playing a game, I'm assuming a role, and I'm now going to operate in the rules of this particular system. That's really what a game is, and that's kind of all it needs to be. Everything else is optional. Rules, competition, doesn't need to be this zero-sum win-lose type thing. So I want to talk real quick about gamification versus gamefulness. Spoiler alert, not a huge fan of gamification. I think it has its place, but I think it's usually a cynical marketing tactic to basically co-opt gaming mechanics to extract something from the user. This is the definition. The latter half of the definition talks about point scoring competition typically as an online marketing technique to encourage engagement with a product or service. I think that's a little bit insincere, and I think the actual real thing you should take from the world of video games is something that author Jane McGonigal talked about in the book Reality is Broken, which is the idea of gamefulness. And gamefulness is having the positive traits of a gamer or a game, such as strong motivation and goal orientation, confidence in one's own capabilities, enjoying the pursuit of new challenges, perseverance in the face of obstacles. People fail over and over and over again in games, and they get back up and they keep trying. And there's a spillover into the real world after you do these things. There's also just a passion for learning new skills, mastery. This is what gamefulness is, and this is really what games are about, not points, streaks, and awards and badges. So I think this is another thing I would love for people to think more about rather than gamifying experience, just making it more of a rewarding experience to be in. So that's an important distinction, and one that I hope everyone carries with them, that when you think video games, just shift from thinking gamification to gainfulness. And it wouldn't be a presentation without an Einstein quote. I don't know why everyone loves Einstein quotes. I don't know, he seems to have addressed kind of everything. I titled this slide, "For Creative Edge, Play Beats Logic." So he said games are the most elevated form of investigation. I think we all are somewhat familiar with his ability to drift between disciplines, and he has a combinatorial nature of metaphor and analogy that he used for his breakthroughs in terms of general relativity. He played music, he thought games were really helpful for him. I also want to contrast this with not his rival, but the other physicists who actually sparked the other revolution that are still at odds in terms of the fundamental theory of physics, which was Niels Bohr, who during a lecture, a student started talking and he interrupted him hastily and said, no, you're not thinking, you're just being logical. And he drew a distinction between thinking and being logical, and I think the point, and I think what we can learn from video games, is that logic alone can't lead you anywhere special. And I think as strategists, we always pride ourselves in being super logical, rational, laying out a story, designing slides that go from start to finish. But there's going to be a missing ingredient, because we talk about finding the white space, but we don't talk a lot about what we're going to put there. And I think if we're all landing in the same white space, we haven't really given our client anything unique. There's no differentiator. If every competitor is drawing the same conclusions. So I think there's an element of whimsy and play that if you inject into a world of rational thought and logic, I think you get extraordinary results. And I think sometimes strategy skews a little too logical. And I think we can kind of maybe take a lesson from these two guys in regards to kind of respecting play a little bit more. So a few examples of experiences out of play. I filmed this at PAX East. I think it'd be a great way to just talk to game developers. And I asked this guy, so like this menu here, how do you make a menu fun? Again, I'm thinking about BMW, I'm thinking about some of the menu systems we had. And he said, oh, you just get a little twisty motion. Right, so I asked him a very abstract question. He knew instantly how to address that. A lot of times when things have an organic sense of motion, and then there's an element of kind of flourish. He's like, even when things are still, make it feel alive, make things drift, make things kind of move. It kind of consumes your world. But I loved asking questions like that. How do you make a menu fun? This is a more sophisticated game, Skyrim. But again, menu system. People are doing this for fun. But it looks like a lot of annoying organization. I mean, these things look cool. So I like to look at menus. I'm actually in the process of cataloging different menu types and giving our UX designers some more material to draw from. Well, what you might have just seen happen is that when you pick your skill, so everyone, you might have a character that has a certain predisposition for a certain type of skill. The menu system is actually, the paradigm is constellations, as if you're born under a certain sign, and you level up different stars of the constellation, which I love because when people think about menus, they don't think about going up and looking up. It's always left, right, down, down, down. So here's something that kind of unlocked a new way of thinking about how menus work, and a nice metaphor that can be kind of a fun, whimsical way to think about leveling up something. And then finally, this is a game called Fez, which is something called a 2.5D game. It's actually a pure 2D game, but you can see it kind of approximates a 3D effect through the kind of pixel art aesthetic. So what you're really seeing is a 2D game, but it's being played on a cube that you can manipulate. So there's basically 4 sides, and every time you turn the cube, it's a new 2D level. And you use this mechanic, and you hit the button every time you want to turn the world in order to solve problems you couldn't otherwise solve. I see this, and I think, how come we're always making page designs that are paginated and swipey? How come we're not turning cubes, right? Now that's an interesting idea that only would have come if I had just gotten done playing Fez before I kind of came into work. So I think super practical and not just trivial, especially with the pixel aesthetic, which is inherently limited. We can't do AAA type graphics on the web. But pixel art and a lot of the pixel games are doing some really impressive stuff with under otherwise kind of limiting constraints. So I want to end, we have just a minute left, with some things you can do. I don't just want to talk and be like, oh, that was interesting. Hopefully you feel like you can go back and don't have to get into the world of gaming fully to kind of take something from it. So one of the things I do, the first thing, I came back from PAX and started a critical gaming channel on Slack, where everyone kind of shares links. So that's a nice way to kind of activate maybe other people in your company who are more into games to share things that they find along the way. These are some topics that I'm exploring at the moment. Again, I could go on this topic for a very long time. There's so many aspects of video games we can learn from. So that's one thing you can do, and maybe it's that way you don't have to bring the insights, you can activate other people at your company. But there's 4 things I wanted to talk about as well. One, talk to game designers. So when you're thinking about research and interviews, talk to game designers, ask them how they make experiences, ask them how they work. Game designers embrace constraints and they live at the intersection of code and immersive engagement. And that's important, right? Because they know their way around code, and if you go into the history of video games, it's all about, okay, we have these constraints, how can we make the best game possible? And they don't run from them, they actually embrace them and find clever solutions. The other thing, as I would say, is talk to gamers. Which isn't something that we think that we want to do all the time. They've grown adept at articulating where an experience starts to lose them and why. And I think ask them that. Like, at what point did you kind of disengage? When did you decide, I don't want to continue playing this game? I want to pick up something else. They're very tough customers. Video games is a tough industry because it's very demanding on hardware and software, and they have the toughest customers in the industry. Super relentless, they will give you no leeway in terms of bugginess and things like that. And then finally, I do suggest reading about games, design solutions, patterns, behavioral insights, terms, concepts, metaphors. I include podcasts here, so maybe reading is a bad word, but like consume words about gaming is probably a better way to put it. One great podcast I listen to now is the Psychology of Games podcast. Great way to just kind of get the contours of the industry and extract some insights. And then finally, of course, play. Gather materials, all material you can use. How can I use this? And craft something new for your clients, not just something logical. And that's really what strategy is all about. And that's it. That's all I got.
So, what are some of the examples in your work, or any of your work, where experience design has been influenced by gainfulness?
Sure. Okay, I'll give you one. So the build your own configurator for BMW. So every car brand has a configurator. It's one of the biggest drivers of leads. Very utilitarian. Shoppers use it for a specific task. They're trying to price out a vehicle. But honestly, especially for BMW, there's a lot of motorsport enthusiasts, and a lot of people just go and just want to play around and customize their dream vehicle. We did take some nods from the gaming industry. For instance, like when you make a selection, it kind of says, "Ooh, good choice!" exclamation point, right? Like these little, kind of bits of encouragement, which was kind of inspired by those little kind of like responses you get to pick up a power up, or there's got to be some, response for you making a decision. Little moments of encouragement. We also refer to it as a studio. We try to invite people in and say, "Look, this is a place to make something, it's not a sophisticated filter, it's a place to create." And if you just give them little nods and invite them to create, those were a couple things. Again, it's not a game, so we can only go so far, but those were drawn from I think the gameful kind of spirit of play. Yeah.
In the spirit of gamefulness, then, I'm going to let you choose your own adventure.
Oh, to choose your own adventure. Let's see, that one kind of answers it. Okay, this is interesting. I have a Bachelor in Science in Game Design. What's the #1 way to make these skills seem appealing to my team? Oh my gosh, I love this. I would say get to the human truth, right? Basically, I mean, the world of play and video games is a petri dish of human behavior. You are seeing accelerated and concentrated some of the most highly focused, motivated people trying to accomplish a task, or the opposite, unplug and enjoy themselves. And I think you learn a lot about motivation, intrinsic motivation, and extrinsic motivation. Some people are motivated by leaderboards, which is extrinsic kind of motivation. Some don't actually, they just want to play single player games. Interviewing gamers, talking to gamers, ask them why they do things, how they do things. When you get to the psychology of play, suddenly then people are like, oh, okay, well that's smart then, right? So, but again, we're always trying to, this is all about people. Also think, if you do, well, here's one thing I do, user journeys, which are kind of part and parcel with the gig, it's something we gotta do. Lay out a user journey, not as a journey, but maybe as a level in a video game. Just use that metaphor. And so there's metaphors you can use that unlock a different, when we think of them not as users, but players, that can unlock helpful insights that you wouldn't have gotten to, I think, otherwise, yeah.
I like that. You use players versus users.
Yeah, we're all playing. And it's also lighten up, right? Like, but it does unlock some really interesting kind of ways of thinking of people with a certain amount of respect. Like, don't take them so seriously because they're just trying to enjoy themselves. Yeah. Do you have examples of how you imbue whimsy, gamefulness into briefs and briefings? Yeah, right. So gifts help. Right? Honestly, a lot of what makes something fun, there's two things, right? One is assuming a role, assuming the identity of something, or controlling something, right? Because it's not you, right? Either you are this character and you're playing this character, or you're manipulating another character, and it's kind of about that. And so briefings, right? Like doing the okay, so imagine you're this person, right? And kind of taking that type of narrative construct, if you're thinking about the user rather than personas, shift right from persona into kind of okay, so here you are, you're going around, it can really help there. I think also motion, we deal with this a lot with our clients as well. They don't really start to smile until something moves, right? Like until you see some motion. So there's something that animation does that triggers this sense that I'm in something that responds and that is somehow tactile, right? There's something about tactility, or at least virtual tactility, that feels kind of fun because it's manipulable, you can play with it, you can then create, and it responds to your actions. So I think imbuing kind of decks with some sense of aliveness really does tend to kind of let people's guard down and say, okay, we're not in clinical serious territory, we can lighten up, we can kind of have some fun, we can smile a little bit. I don't know why, but every indie developer I talk to kind of always talks about motion and ways to make even pixels kind of have a sense of life.
Yeah. It's interesting. It says that they have a sense of clarity about the response they want to evoke from someone.
That's right.
Ooh.
Yeah, wonder, delight, or surprise, and making sure it's not too surprising. They strike a balance between. There's an appeal of difficulty. I'm fascinated by this. There's an appeal that you can't make it too difficult, unless you do, in which that's part of the game dynamic, like a game like Dark Souls. But you can't make it too easy. If you make a game too easy, if you remove all the friction from a game, you've made it terrible. You've made it boring. So they know how to strike that balance in terms of the appeal of difficulty and leveraging that, and they do it on an intuitive level. So I would also say, from a recruiting standpoint, open up your aperture and maybe look at the world of gaming, because there's people desperate to work for you and use their love of games. Yeah. So maybe we can kind of start to mine different pools of talent. So.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.